My grandmother used to say that the truth has a way of finding its own moment. She said it like it was comfort, like it was something gentle. I didn't understand what she meant until the night of my mother's 60th birthday party, when I stood in the middle of a room full of 40 relatives, held up a folder of documents, and watched my sister's face go completely white. But I need to start from the beginning. Because the beginning matters. And because if I skip it, you won't understand why what happened that night wasn't cruelty, it was just the truth, finally finding its moment. My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 34 years old, and I work as a licensed accountant in Kitchener, Ontario. I have a small apartment, a cat named Biscuit, and until about 8 months ago, I believed that my family, despite all its imperfections, was fundamentally decent. I believed that when something went wrong between people who loved each other, it was usually because of misunderstanding, miscommunication, the ordinary mess of being human. I don't believe that anymore. My grandmother, her full name was Dorothy, but nobody called her that except telemarketers, and the CRA was the kind of woman who held a room together without anyone noticing she was doing it. She baked butter tarts at Christmas. She remembered every birthday without writing anything down. She drove herself to her own doctor's appointments until she was 81, and when the doctor finally told her she had to stop, she called me first, before she called my mother, before she called my sister Renee, and she said, "Nora, I think I'm going to need a little help now. Can you come on Tuesdays?" So I came on Tuesdays. Every Tuesday for 2 years, I drove the 40 minutes from Kitchener to her house in Guelph, and I helped her with groceries, and I sat with her at the kitchen table, and we talked about everything, about her childhood in Cape Breton, about my grandfather, who died when I was 7, about what she was afraid of and what she wasn't afraid of and the difference between the two. She told me once, on a Tuesday in February, when the snow was coming sideways against the window, that she had already decided what to do with her house and her savings. She said she had spoken to a lawyer. She said everything was arranged. She didn't tell me the details because, she said, it wasn't really about the details. It was about making sure the people she loved were taken care of. "I've watched too many families get torn apart over money," she said. "I didn't want that for mine." I thought about that conversation a lot, later on. I thought about how she said it with such certainty, like the arrangements she'd made were solid, like they were safe. She passed away 14 months ago, on a Thursday morning in November, quietly, in her own bed. She was 83. The hospice nurse called me at 6:47 in the morning, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of my building for almost an hour before I could drive. The funeral was on a Saturday. My mother flew in from Victoria, where she and my stepfather had been living for the past 4 years. My sister Renée drove up from Hamilton with her husband, Craig, and their 2 kids. My uncle came from Moncton. Extended family filtered in throughout the week, and through all of it, my sister Renée was everywhere organizing, arranging, speaking to the funeral director, fielding calls from the lawyer. I remember being grateful. I remember thinking, she's handling so much. I should do more to help. I didn't know then that what she was actually doing was making sure I couldn't see anything clearly. About 3 weeks after the funeral, the estate lawyer, a man named Mr. Fenwick, whom my grandmother had used for decades, sent a letter to our family. I received a copy. It outlined the distribution of my grandmother's estate, which included her house in Guelph and a savings account that, according to the letter, contained approximately $190,000. According to the letter, my grandmother had left everything to my mother, to be divided equally among her children, which meant my mother, myself, and Renée, with a small provision, set aside for my uncle. I read it twice. Then I set it down. Then I thought about something my grandmother had told me. Also on a Tuesday. Also at that kitchen table. She had said that she wanted to make sure her grandchildren weren't left out. She had specifically said she'd spoken to the lawyer about it. She had said, "You and Renée work so hard. I want to leave you something that means something." She had never, in any of those conversations, suggested that everything would go to my mother first. I called Renée that evening. I said, gently, that I'd read the letter and I had a few questions about how grandmother had structured things. I said maybe we should all sit down together, the three of us, and go over it. Renée said, "Nora, this isn't really a good time." The kids are, and then there was a sound in the background and she said she'd call me back. She didn't call me back. I tried twice more over the following 2 weeks. Both times, she was busy. Both times, she said we'd talk soon. Both times, we didn't. I called my mother. My mother, who had recently had a minor cardiac event and was under instruction from her doctor not to stress herself, said she trusted Renée completely to handle the estate. She said Renée had been so wonderful through the whole thing. She said, "Your sister has really stepped up, Nora. I hope you appreciate that." I said I did. I didn't say what I was actually thinking, which was that the letter from Mr. Fenwick didn't match anything my grandmother had ever told me. I didn't say that I'd counted the months since the funeral and realized Renée had been alone with Mr. Fenwick's office at least 3 times before that letter went out. I didn't say any of that because I had no proof, and because I didn't want to upset my mother, and because some part of me was still hoping there was a simple explanation I was missing. There wasn't. It took me 4 months to find out what had actually happened. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single revelation. It was more like a photograph, slowly developing in a darkroom, details emerging one at a time, each one making the image a little clearer and a little worse. The first detail came from my cousin Margot, who mentioned, casually, over the phone in January, that Renée had told her the house in Guelph had already been listed. "Moving fast," Margot said. "I guess that makes sense. Real estate in Guelph is still pretty good." I hadn't known the house was listed. Nobody had told me. The second detail came from Mr. Fenwick's office, when I called and asked, politely, whether I could arrange a time to review my grandmother's estate documents. His assistant put me on hold for a long time. When she came back, she said Mr. Fenwick had retired. She gave me the name of the colleague who had taken over his files. The colleague, a woman named Miss Aberhart, called me back 2 days later. She was professional and careful, but there was something in her tone, a slight hesitation before certain words that made me pay attention. She said she could share with me only what pertained directly to my portion of the estate. She said there were aspects of the documentation she was reviewing herself, in preparation for a follow-up meeting. I asked what that meant. She paused. Then she said, "Miss Callahan, I'd recommend you retain independent legal counsel before we speak further." I sat very still after that call. I sat still for about 5 minutes, and then I called a lawyer named Mr. Osei, who had been recommended to me by a colleague at work. Mr. Osei is patient and methodical and does not alarm easily. He reviewed everything. I had the letter from Mr. Fenwick's office, my notes from conversations with my grandmother, some texts I'd saved from Renée in the weeks after the funeral, and he made some inquiries of his own. What he found, after about 6 weeks, was this. My grandmother had indeed made a will with Mr. Fenwick's office. It had been updated 2 years before her death, and in that version, the version she described to me at the kitchen table, the estate was divided, the house to be sold and proceeds split 3 ways between my mother, Renée, and me, with 10% to my uncle, and an additional 20,000, each set aside specifically for Renée's children. That was the will she intended. That was what she'd arranged. But there was a second document, a codicil, dated 8 months before her death, a period during which my grandmother had had a small stroke that affected her memory and her ability to read fine print clearly, that amended the distribution significantly. Under the codicil, the house and the entirety of the savings went to my mother outright, removing my specific share entirely, and giving Renée, as my mother's named executor with full discretionary authority, effective control over all of it. Mr. Osei explained it carefully. He said that codicils are legitimate instruments, and that this one appeared to have been properly witnessed. He said that challenging it would be difficult. He also said that the timing was notable, and that the language in the codicil was unusually broad, and that it was worth understanding the full circumstances of how it came to exist. I asked how we would find that out. He said he had already requested a meeting with Miss Aberhart, and he said there was one other thing I should know. The house in Guelph had sold in February. The proceeds had already been deposited. My mother had received a transfer of just over $310,000, combined with the savings, within the past 2 months. I thought about the butter tarts at Christmas. I thought about my grandmother at the kitchen table saying, "I've watched too many families get torn apart over money. I didn't want that for mine." I went home that night, and I sat with Biscuit on the couch and I didn't cry. I'd already cried. I'd cried when she died, and I'd cried at the funeral, and I'd cried in the car outside my building at 6:47 in the morning when the hospice nurse called. I was done crying. What I felt now was something cooler and quieter and much more purposeful. I started keeping records. I documented every conversation I could remember with my grandmother about the estate. I found old emails. She had used email, slowly and with tremendous effort, until about a year before she died, in which she mentioned, in passing, things that aligned with what she'd told me. I found a card she'd sent me for my 32nd birthday in which she wrote, in her careful handwriting, "I want to make sure you and your sister are both looked after. That's what I've arranged." I put everything in a folder. Mr. Osei was working in parallel, through Miss Aberhart. He obtained copies of the original will and the codicil. He spoke to the witnesses listed on the codicil, both of whom, it emerged, were neighbors of Renée, not of my grandmother. He also spoke, very carefully, to the care coordinator who had been visiting my grandmother during the months after her stroke, a woman named Mrs. Tran, who said she had noticed that someone she described, a woman matching Renée's description, had been at the house frequently during that period, and that on at least one occasion, she had arrived to find my grandmother looking confused and tired, and saying she'd just had to sign a lot of papers. Mrs. Tran had noted it in her care file. She had noted it at the time because she thought it was worth recording. She hadn't known what the papers were. I want to be honest with you about something. During those weeks, there were moments when I almost stopped. When I thought, she's my sister. We shared a bedroom until I was 12. We fought over the bathroom and borrowed each other's clothes and called each other from college when things were hard. She sent me a card when I passed my CPA exams. She was in the delivery room when her daughter was born, and she called me from the hospital, crying, and said, "Nora, you have to come see her. You have to come right now." I almost stopped. Not because I thought I was wrong. I knew I wasn't wrong, but because there is a particular grief in realizing that someone you loved has been capable of something like this. It doesn't make you want to fight. It makes you want to sit down somewhere quiet and be very sad for a very long time. What kept me going was something smaller than justice. It was a memory of my grandmother trying to read a document with her glasses on, squinting at the fine print, and saying to me, "Nora, I can't make sense of this. I need someone who understands these things." She had trusted someone to explain things to her clearly, and they hadn't. That's what kept me going. By April, Mr. Osei had built a file that, while not conclusive enough for criminal proceedings, was substantial enough to raise serious questions about the validity of the codicil. He had the 2 witnesses, the care coordinator's notes, the timeline, the original will, my grandmother's emails, and the birthday card, and a statement from a geriatric specialist who, after reviewing the medical records, indicated that my grandmother's cognitive state, during the period the codicil was signed, would have made it very difficult for her to fully comprehend a complex legal document without clear, unbiased assistance. He advised me that we had grounds to challenge the codicil in a state court. He said it would be a long process, possibly 18 months or more. He said Renée would likely deny everything. He said my mother would be caught in the middle, and given her health, that was a serious consideration. He also said something else. He said that people in situations like this one often have a moment where the other party makes a mistake, where they do something that accelerates things, that shifts the dynamic, that forces the matter into the open before they're ready. He said he'd seen it happen. He said I should be prepared for that, in case it came. It came in May. My mother's 60th birthday party had been planned for the second Saturday of June. Renée had organized it. Of course, she was the organizer. Always. And it was being held at my aunt and uncle's house in Burlington, which was large enough to hold the 40-odd relatives and family friends who'd been invited. My mother was flying in from Victoria. There would be catering. There would be a slideshow. There would be, Renée had told me in a group text, a special presentation about the family. I'd said I would be there. I'd said it without any particular plan. At that point, I was still expecting everything to unfold quietly, through lawyers, over 18 months. And then, 3 weeks before the party, Renée called me. It was a Saturday afternoon, and she called, not texted, which was unusual. Her voice was warm and friendly in a way that was so careful it made the back of my neck prickle. She said she wanted to check in. She said she'd been thinking about me. She said she was worried that I'd been a little distant since grandmother passed, and she hoped I was doing okay. She said family was so important, especially now. I said I was fine. I said I agreed that family was important. Then she said, very casually, that she'd heard from someone she didn't say who, that I'd been asking questions about the estate. She said she understood that grief could make people look for explanations, for someone to blame. She said she hoped I wasn't putting myself through unnecessary stress. She said the estate was all handled, it had all been done properly, and she hoped I could find some peace. I listened to all of that. I let her finish. Then I said, "Thanks for checking in, Renée. I'll see you at the party." She paused for just a moment. Then she said, "Yes, of course. It'll be wonderful." I called Mr. Osei 20 minutes later. I told him what she'd said. I said someone had told her I was asking questions, which meant she knew the inquiry was happening, which meant she might try to get ahead of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Nora, it might be time to think carefully about what you want the next step to be." I thought about it for 3 days. And then I told him what I wanted. 2 things, I said. First, I wanted a complete documentation package, the original will, the codicil, the timeline, Mrs. Tran's statement, the geriatric specialist's assessment, everything organized clearly enough that a non-lawyer could understand it. Second, I asked whether he knew, or could find, a notary or legal professional who might be willing to be present at a social event for a brief period of time, not in an official capacity, just as someone who could speak knowledgeably if questions were asked. He was quiet again for a longer moment. Then he said, "I do know someone, actually. Let me make a call." The party was on a Saturday in June. The sun was out. My aunt's backyard was strung with lights, and there were tables set up with white cloths, and my mother was wearing a yellow dress and looked genuinely happy, which made what came later harder than I expected. I arrived at 4 o'clock, the same as everyone else. I had a gift for my mother, a framed photograph of her and my grandmother taken about 6 years ago, at Christmas, that I'd had restored and printed large. I'd brought it because it was a true gift. Whatever else happened that night, her birthday was real. I wanted to get that right. The first 2 hours were ordinary. I talked with cousins I hadn't seen since the funeral. I ate the catered food. I watched Renée's children run across the lawn and thought about how none of what had happened was their fault and never would be. My brother-in-law Craig kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't read, not guilty, exactly, but cautious, the way someone looks when they're waiting for something. The slideshow was at 7. Family photos, going back decades. My grandmother appeared in many of them, and there was a moment when a photo appeared of her and me, taken on a Tuesday, at that kitchen table, and I had to look at the centerpiece for a moment to get through it. After the slideshow, Renée stood up. She had a glass of wine and she was smiling, and she said she wanted to say a few words about family, and about her mother, and about how grateful they all were to be there. She talked for about 4 minutes. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. And then, at the end, still smiling, she said, "I also want to say, because I think it's important that we're all honest with each other. I've heard that there's been some confusion in the family lately. Some questions being asked about grandmother's estate, and I want to address that directly, because I think clarity is a gift." She paused. Grandmother's wishes were carried out exactly as she intended. Everything was handled properly and legally. And I hope that anyone who has doubts, and here she looked at me for just a moment, very briefly, with a smile still on her face, will come to me directly, rather than, she made a small gesture, other channels. 40 people were looking in various directions. Some were looking at Renée. Some, I noticed, were now looking at me. My mother was looking at her wine glass. I waited until Renée sat down. I waited for about 30 seconds, long enough that the room had begun to shift back into its normal hum. Then I stood up. I said, "Actually, since we're being honest, I'd like to add something." The room went quiet very quickly. I said I loved my grandmother. I said I had spent every Tuesday with her for 2 years, and that she had told me, clearly, and more than once, what she had intended for her estate. I said I had believed, for a long time, that there was probably a misunderstanding somewhere, that I didn't want to think what the alternative was. I said that I'd retained a lawyer. I said his name was Mr. Osei. I said he had spent the past several months reviewing the estate documents and had found significant concerns about the circumstances under which the codicil to my grandmother's will was signed. I said those concerns included the timing, the witnesses, and the medical assessment of my grandmother's cognitive capacity at the time she signed. The room was so quiet I could hear the string lights humming. I said that Mr. Osei was not present tonight because this was a birthday party, and I had wanted to respect that. But I said there was someone who was present. I gestured toward the back of the room, where a man in a navy blazer, a colleague of Mr. Osei's named Mr. Tiara, a notary with 15 years of estate experience, was sitting at a table near the back, where he had been quietly eating catered food for the past 2 hours. Mr. Tiara raised a hand and nodded pleasantly at the room. I said that Mr. Tiara was here simply as someone who could answer questions, if anyone had them, about what the documents I'd brought actually said. I said I was not trying to turn my mother's birthday party into a legal proceeding. I said I was, however, done having things handled in my absence without my knowledge. Then I opened the folder. I did not read every page aloud. I showed 3 things. The first was a scan of the original will, with the distribution highlighted, the 3-way split, my specific share, the provisions for my grandmother's grandchildren that she had told me about at the kitchen table. The second was the timeline Mr. Osei had prepared, showing the sequence of events between my grandmother's stroke, the visits Renée had made to the house during that period, and the date the codicil was signed. The third was the birthday card, the one in my grandmother's handwriting that said, "I want to make sure you and your sister are both looked after. That's what I've arranged." I passed the birthday card to my mother first. I handed it to her directly. She looked at it for a long time. Her face didn't do anything dramatic. She just looked at it. And then she looked up at Renée. And Renée, for the first time since I could remember, had nothing to say. Craig put his hand on the table. He looked at his wife. Then he looked at me. And what I saw on his face in that moment wasn't anger. It was something closer to relief, the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for a pressure that's been building to finally release. My cousin Margot, who was sitting across the table from me, said very quietly, "Oh, Nora." My aunt said, "Someone explained to me what is happening." People started talking, not all at once, but gradually, the way a room fills with sound when everyone has something to say and nobody is sure who should say it first. My mother was still holding the birthday card. Renée said my name once, sharply, and I looked at her and I said, "I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this because grandmother asked me to come on Tuesdays, and I came, and I listened, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear what she told me." Mr. Tiara spoke for about 8 minutes, at the request of 2 of my uncles who asked him directly to explain what a codicil was and under what circumstances it could be contested. He was clear and calm and used no jargon, and when he was done, the table was quiet again. My mother looked at Renée and said, in a voice I had never heard her use before, small and certain and very tired, "Did you know what you were asking her to sign?" And Renée said nothing. She looked at her wine glass. She looked at Craig. She looked at her children, who were sitting at the kids' table across the yard, too far away to hear, and something moved across her face that was complicated and real, and not something I was glad to witness. She didn't answer my mother's question, but she didn't deny it either. The party ended about 40 minutes later. My aunt quietly asked the caterers to pack up. People drifted out in small groups. Several relatives hugged me on the way out. My cousin Margot held on for an extra moment and whispered, "She would have wanted you to do this." And I nodded because I didn't trust my voice right then. My mother and I sat in my aunt's kitchen after everyone else had left. She held the birthday card in both hands. She asked me how long I had known. I told her everything, the conversations with my grandmother, Mr. Osei, the witnesses, Mrs. Tran, the timeline. I told her gently, and I told her honestly, and I watched her face move through things. I recognized grief, disbelief, the particular pain of being the person caught in the middle who trusted the wrong person. At one point she said, "I thought she was handling it. I thought I could trust her to handle it." I said, "I know." She said, "Did your grandmother know? At the end, did she know what had happened?" I said I didn't know. I hoped not. We sat there for a long time. The legal process is still ongoing. Mr. Osei has filed a formal challenge to the codicil. The timeline is uncertain. He estimates resolution may take 12 to 18 months from the filing date. Renée has retained her own lawyer. Craig, I was told by Margot, has retained a separate one. What that means for them, for their marriage, for their family, is not something I think about if I can help it. Those are consequences they created and will have to navigate. My mother has temporarily paused any distribution of the estate pending the outcome of the challenge. She made that decision herself, on her own, and she called me to tell me before she told Renée. That phone call was the first time she'd called me first in a long time. I noticed. There is a question I've been asked more than once since that night. By Margot, by two of my uncles, even, in a careful text the following week, by my brother-in-law Craig. The question is some version of, was it worth it? Was it worth doing it that way, in that room, on that night? I've thought about how to answer that honestly. What I did was not elegant. A birthday party is not a courtroom, and I'm aware that I walked into my mother's celebration carrying a folder of legal documents and a notary. I am aware that 40 people went home that night carrying a version of my family that they will never be able to put back the way it was. But I also think about my grandmother at that kitchen table, squinting at documents she couldn't read clearly, trusting that the person helping her was helping her honestly. I think about what it would have meant to her to know that someone was paying attention, that someone had kept the letters, that someone had saved the birthday card. I think she knew, when she called me on Tuesdays, that I was the one who would pay attention. What she did for me, in those 2 years of Tuesdays, was far more than any inheritance. She taught me that showing up consistently, without drama, without needing credit for it, is one of the most important things you can do for someone you love. She taught me that the details matter, not the big moments, but the small, steady ones, the Tuesday ones. She also taught me, without ever meaning to, that the truth has a patience that outlasts even the most careful deception. You can redirect it, delay it, sign a codicil over it, but you can't extinguish it. It waits. It finds its moment. She was right about that. It was a comfort. In the end. Just not the gentle kind. If there is anything I want someone to take from this, it is not that you should always fight. Sometimes fighting costs more than it gives back, and only you can make that calculation for yourself. But I want you to know this. If you are being told that something wrong is right, and you feel the wrongness of it in your body, in the part of you that kept the birthday card and remembered the Tuesday conversations, trust that. Document it. Speak to someone who knows the law. Don't wait for permission to ask questions about things that directly affect you. And if someone in your family tells you that asking questions is disloyal, pay very close attention to why asking questions frightens them so much. My grandmother called me on Tuesdays because she trusted me. I showed up because I loved her, and when the moment came, I had the folder, and the birthday card, and a notary in a navy blazer, and I was ready. That's the whole story. That's all of it. If any part of this sounds familiar, if you've been kept from something that was yours, or pushed out of a process you had a right to be part of, or handed a version of events that didn't match what you knew to be true, tell me in the comments. I read them. And you are not as alone in this as you think you are.